Welcome back to the program. With me now, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Alan Tudge. Mr Tudge, thanks for your time. First of all, the ice epidemic. We heard the Prime Minister announce this task force, a nationwide awareness campaign. It's quite horrific, isn't it, when you look at the stats, the rise in the use of it, and how damaging it is, how addictive this drug is.
Yeah, that's right, Kieran, and it occurs across every aspect of Australian society, in every single town, in every suburb of our community and across all demographics. And it is such a dangerous drug, it is so addictive, and it is so destructive on individual families and on children that we've got to get on top of it. It was interesting, the Australian Crime Commission outlined a report just a month ago, and it had some very sobering reading, showing that the usage of ice had doubled over the last few years, that about 60% of their of major criminals are involved in the ice epidemic as well. So this is a serious crime problem, and it absolutely destroys families.
The former Victorian Police Commissioner Ken Lay will head the task force. That is a good choice to undertake this enormous task, because it obviously there's got to be, as part of this awareness campaign, an awareness of just how addictive this is. It can't be just tried without any sort of risk. This is horrific.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's a lot of evidence which says you can try it just once and you can become addicted just from the first use of it. Now, this task force is going to look at a few things. It is going to look at the supply side issues through our crime enforcement mechanisms, which are so important. We've already got many mechanisms underway there. It's obviously looking at the demand side as well, because we don't want anybody to even try it once. And thirdly, it has to look at what impact it has on families and on children, and what support mechanisms can be put in place. Because often an ice user can destroy that family, can mean that children are being neglected, because it really does take over your mind, this drug. Yeah. And those things need to be looked at as well.
Let's look to some issues on the economic front. The front page of the Australian today suggesting the government's looking at reining in the treatment of the part pension for those better well-off pensioners, in terms of how much in assets they can have before they start losing the pension altogether. This was something that was the more generous treatment of it established by the Howard government back in 2006, when the surplus was upwards of $17 billion. Is much of what you're trying to do here in reining in the welfare spend, I suppose, unwinding what the Howard Costello years delivered?
It's not necessarily unwinding. Our overall objective is to make the pension sustainable for the long term. And at the moment, it's not on a sustainable trajectory, because it goes from about 2.7% of GDP, which is what the pension constitutes presently, all the way up to about 3.5% of GDP in the decades ahead. Now, almost everybody today, except for the Labor Party, recognises that the pension's not sustainable. So we are open to serious propositions, serious suggestions, which will make the pension sustainable for the long term. We want it to be a good pension, we want it to be a growing pension, but it has to be there and sustainable in the longer term.
And in this context, you won't affect basically the vast bulk of pensioners or part pensioners. This is for those more well-off individuals who are still receiving a part pension, despite having, in some cases, a multi-million-dollar family home and net assets of upwards of $1 million.
Yeah, so we've made it very clear that we won't be incorporating the family home into the assets test. But the proposal which has been put is to look at what's called the tapering rate, and whether or not that should be reduced, such that if you've got, as you point out, $1 million in assets outside of your family home, should there be a faster tapering off of the part pension? Now, that's something which we will look at. We'll also look at other proposals which have been put to us from ACOS and other parties who are seriously interested in tackling this issue.
And the family home still remains not part of the equation. I guess of course it's a sensitive area, but if someone's got a $5 million home and $1 million in assets, whereas if someone's got a $1 million home and $5 million in assets, they're going to be treated very differently under the framework you're putting.
Yeah, we've made it very clear though about the family home, that it won't be included in the assets test, and the reason being that your home doesn't produce any cash for you on a weekly or fortnightly basis. So your home, you may have bought that for $50,000 3 or 4 decades ago. Perhaps it's worth $500,000 or $1 million today. But as far as the pensioner is concerned, it's still just a home and isn't producing a cash flow on a weekly basis. So that's why we don't think it's appropriate to include it.
Finally, on the issue of tax avoidance, with the Senate committee underway in Sydney, do you see some merit in what Labor's proposing in terms of changes to the debt equity ratio, as it's called? That basically they want it averaged out to a company's exposure worldwide as opposed to the current situation. Do you think that makes sense?
We've got concerns about that proposal, in part because most of the business community have said that this will impact on jobs and on economic growth, because there are times when you do want some additional debt in particular countries. For example, if you have a big investment proposal, and debt is sometimes cheaper than equity. We've actually already put in place a number of measures to address some of the multinational tax avoidance issues. The first thing we did was introduce legislation to tighten what's called the thin capitalisation rules. The second thing is we've put in additional resources, and this includes actually embedding ATO officials into some of the larger multinational companies based here in Australia.
Including the tech giants?
We haven't mentioned which companies they are operating within, but some of the larger multinational companies which are based here in Australia. And thirdly, of course, we've been leading the international effort through our leadership of the G20, because it does need to be an international effort, of course, as well, with the overall principle being that you should tax the companies where they earn their profits. So that's the guiding principle, and we're making some headway towards that.
How much do you think in terms of scope are we talking about here, in terms of revenue?
That's the thing I want to caution the Australian public on, and because the Labor Party give the impression that this is a huge money pot, but even under their own policy proposal, they're only going to raise, it's not an insignificant amount, but about $500 or $600 million per annum. But that only constitutes about 0.1%. A 0.1% increase of the government's revenue. Okay. So it's a relatively small amount still.
Alan Tudge, thanks for your time this morning. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Kieran.
That's all for AM Agenda. Thanks for your company. Sports Line next with Jim Callanan and the build-up to the